You again for uh, being a part of Unfound on the Ground number 2. The title for this second session is Researching and Analyzing Missing Persons Cases, Part 1, Developing and Maintaining Human Sources. This session is being recorded, audio only, although video and audio participation are both options. Only the audio is being recorded. Chat is disabled. And again, let me just one more time, for the sake of due diligence and consistency, articulate the following for the journalistic, promotional, and/or commercial purposes of Unfound. The audio recording of this digital meeting will be distributed by Unfound. By participating in this digital meeting, you agree to give Unfound permission to use the audio recording of your words for journalistic, promotional, and/or commercial purposes with no compensation to you from Unfound, its assistants, its affiliates, its partners, etc. By now, some or all of you have seen that our Unfound on the Ground number 1 is available through the YouTube channel. I did, and I want to thank everybody who sent feedback also and who participated in and based on the first session. We're applying what we can episode by episode as we sort through that. So whether you submitted feedback on Facebook or you did that through email, we read it. We do what we can. We're moving forward on that. For instance, the guiding questions being sent out, or at least some sketch of them, and other things. For instance, too, any of the references that I mentioned during this talk, I will also send out on email, and we have some other ideas about documenting those. And so that'll be good. Again, keep your mic muted. Unless you're talking, there's a way to do that through Zoom, or you can do that on your end, just in case we don't get any of that extra noise. Again, my disclaimer, as I mentioned the last time, I'm operating here. Again, I'm Eric Grabowski, part of the assisting team at Unfound. I'm also do my own cold case journalism beyond my work in academia as a teacher and scholar of communication. My participation here, my words don't necessarily reflect the views of my employing university. And at any point, if you want to put out a disclaimer or clarify, feel free to do so along the way. Don't forget the website, theunfoundpodcast.com, theunfoundpodcast.com. Visit it often, share it often. I do want to mention something today as we dig into this issue of establishing and maintaining human sources. Obviously Unfound, Ed does a lot of great work with sources and interviews. And although we're certainly want to learn from that and support that, in some ways today we're talking about some general things, obviously mentioning some things tied to Unfound, not necessarily talking about or even reflecting every method or mindset that Ed has, and getting into those nuts and bolts. Maybe in the future we can ask Ed to give some of his expert advice, but he does a great job and he does really good work on that. I do want to mention, and this is something I had in mind, but maybe prompted a little bit by today, a really good episode, and one that really shows the overlap between looking at various types of evidence, including human sources, is, of course, the Cameron Remer case, which, of course, is available. It's a very long episode, great episode. If you haven't listened to that already, listen to it. If you listened to part of it, listen to all of it. Some of us on the assisting team did play a role, but obviously Ed did a lot of legwork. That's a case, obviously. It's an important case. I haven't listened to today's session yet. There was another discussion that Ed had with Dr. Grace A. Telesco, Nova Southeastern University in Florida. I haven't listened to it. It's on the YouTube channel from what I understand. It was live today. Obviously, I think the Cameron Remer case was part of this second discussion they did. So I haven't heard that. I don't know to what extent that would be directly relevant to our discussion here, but certainly that's an extension of the Remer case as covered by Unfound. That's a very good case for seeing how various types of evidence research, including getting that human perspective, is important. So that's one I want to put out there, especially because of what occurred today. A lot of this is guided by that those words that I always utter. Someone out there knows something or knows someone who knows something, and so that's why it's important to keep networking and thinking through ways to interact with credible people. Just a note too is, when we talk about finding people, and we will be doing at least another episode here on the future Unfound on the Ground about some of the technical ways of finding people, and there's a couple of us who have some expertise there. So we won't necessarily get in today to the various websites. If you've identified someone that you want to talk to, or you think that Ed should talk to, or some other journalist should talk to, and you want to gather as much information as possible, we will do a separate session on resources for accurately finding people, or at least to the best extent possible, finding people to see if you found the right person, and to corroborate, to make sure you have the right person. So that'll be an extension of this. That is very important. Obviously, when you identify someone, or one or more persons who need to be talked to or interviewed, or who might have fact or perspective on fact or some analysis, but that is something down the road for sure. I do want to mention again, and of course, some of this is grounded in a journalistic perspective, and not everyone here who hears this program, this episode, is necessarily going to do professional or freelance journalism or citizen journalism. Oh, that's something to think about. Um, Even if you're doing advocacy, or you're involved in some sort of collaboration, and the things that we talked about in the first session, and even as audience members, understanding how all this comes together, that's so important. So this is really relevant for all those points of view, all those perspectives. So wanted to get that out there, and kind of a first question before I dive into some of the points, first phase at least, of what I wanted to cover, just to get at least one of our guiding questions out there to get some discussion going. From your vantage point, why and how when you have human sources, and whether you've done this work, if you've done blogging or your own work, or you've enjoyed Ed's programs or other programs, right? What do these human sources bring to the table? And what types of human sources, in your view, are relevant for these missing persons cases? And Tanya, I'll start with you. If you want to share, if you want to pass, that's okay too. Tanya, anything you'd like to say? What does that bring to the table for these cases, human sources?
Hi. The only thing that came up for me in that was, I was just thinking about maybe some sort of a like a short-term certification program of sorts, to kind of get people who have never been in these types of roles to, but have the passion and the interest and the drive to do something to help these cases at a very early stage. And so I was just thinking about that, like having some type of a short-term certification type program, just to get people prepared. So when something like that does happen in their community, they can act quickly and collaborate together right away.
Yeah, no, that's, again, insightful, because that links over to either the crowdsourcing aspect in some cases, and certainly for some who'd want to be more openly involved, citizen journalism, or if they just want to be quietly helpful to law enforcement and police. And there's definitely ways that That would be, that's interesting. And maybe more training and development is what you're talking about, right?
Right, training and development and having some type of short-term program they can go through, but they have to go through a security clearance, and that would give them a background check. They have to make sure that they're drug-free and that they're mentally healthy and ready to take on a job like that. But so there'd be different criteria, but that's the kind of thing that just kept jumping out at me as I was going over the questions. I guess that's the way my mind works with this.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And obviously that comes down to the various roles that people are playing. Concha, how about you? Why is it important to be connected with, human sources when we're thinking about missing persons cases? And again, it's okay if you want to pass. Okay. Well, I can always come back. Kathy, how about you? Anything you like to add? Why is it, what are you having human sources relevant to thinking through these missing persons cases, and maybe what types would be relevant?
Well, you can't do too much without the people, the people in the community or the area, or people who are interested in helping someone find their missing loved one.
Yeah.
So any volunteer who, like Tanya was saying about people, pass the security test or whatever, make sure they're good people that will help. They have the best goals in mind to try to find the person. And with that, they might have some good suggestions for each particular disappearance, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Trying to find witnesses, reliable, because so many witnesses just tell stories or try to insert themselves into a disappearance. But things like that, I think, might get things kind of started, because you can't wait. You need to act as quick as you can.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is helpful that I started out with this question, because it reminded me to just touch upon something here, and we're all pointing in, and there's a range of directions. So oftentimes, particularly from a journalistic perspective, but not exclusively, but for sure, is we're thinking about human sources in terms of fact and trying to ascertain and corroborate, right? So you have your various sorts of, documentary evidence, and you're getting, trying to get accounts of what people know. And the one question I mentioned, direct, indirect, and I even mentioned contextual sources. And that's just my way of, you might run into someone who has really even not much, if any, knowledge about a case, but they really know a lot about the area, right? Maybe they've done some history or journalism on their own, or they're just someone who's knowledgeable about the area. But then you also do, in whether we're talking about everyday people or actual experts, people that, again, regardless of their level of factual knowledge directly about a case at the start, they might have some analytical contributions to make along the way. And then, of course, some of you are also hinting at sort of the collaboration theme, kind of carrying that forward. If we can get more people involved, then, maybe they could be helpful in that networking side or promotional side that then draws more people into the mix, that there could be, potential human sources out there that could speak directly or indirectly to a case. Family members are obviously going to be important, right? Ed does a great job with that, but there are other folks, family, friends, community people. And then when a case happens, when there is a missing person, right? And as we just heard, right, we need to move quickly in getting people to talk. And obviously when you're working with human sources, you're going with and then beyond sort of the tips, right? Obviously you're, if anyone knows anything, and then from that point, and whether it's the police doing it or a local media outlet or a family member even on their own, then the question is ascertaining, the credibility and then the connection of that source. Natasha, how about you? Why are these human sources relevant for these cases, and what types of human sources would be relevant for missing persons cases, Natasha?
Hi, everyone. My job at Unfound as a digital editor is to lay the groundwork for people to feel comfortable to leave comments in the website. And we have actually received credible comments and credible leads. So all I have to do then is just to moderate the comment, approve it, and then make sure that it is forwarded to what I consider my managers, which would be Ed and Cherie. And I really like that because nowadays, for someone to come up to you just out of the blue, I think we've talked about this before somewhere, but it's a stranger. People feel so much more comfortable just sending a text or sending a comment and then leaving their email account for further follow-up. And it just seems to be a 24/7, very easy way to inform.
Yeah, that's helpful, and that's a really good example. Concha, I want to come back to you just to make sure. And again, if you pass, you pass, just to make sure it wasn't a tech issue. Is there anything you'd like to add to this? Why are these human sources relevant, and maybe what sorts of human sources? Okay, and again, that's okay, no problem there. Yeah, and from and this is certainly true for Unfound, and is we talk about, I don't want to say the end product because some of these cases are ongoing, but in terms of what's put out there consistently, and this really works well with Unfound, is because the ongoing commentary, whether it's the think tank or the discussions and the live show, right? It's people really enjoy sort of the depth, not only of the treatment of the cases in general, but the depth of some of the interviews. And you talk about what's needed, and Ed does a great job at this. Certainly this is important if you're going to do this on your own at any level. There's a diplomacy that goes with being able to establish a rapport with someone, to develop that credibility and that comfort to be able to talk about something. And there's a timing that goes with it, and this is a challenge because in a sense, when we're navigating, especially a missing persons case, even if the missing persons case is decades old, and this goes back to stuff we talked about in the last session, right? We have this passion. One of you mentioned passion. We have this sense of urgency, and we want to know more. We want to network for the good, and but people are going to be have comfort levels of talking at different paces. So establishing rapport. I know myself, I've learned by experience on one of my own cases, and certainly I'll mention it again with the Donna Michaelenko case. That was at least in one case, talking to a potential source, which I won't get into here, but I probably took it a little too quickly on the front end, and I don't want to say aggressive. Maybe that's the case, not mean aggressive, but you have to navigate that. And certainly someday I might retry that with a different communication framework. But that happens. But sometimes, because of the time that you have, or the time that the time that someone else's has, and it needs to have a quicker pace. So that's a challenge for sure. So rapport and trust, obviously the credibility, verification, and the idea of, and we know this is audience of media, and we know this from schooling, and we know this from any sort of research, right? You're constantly trying to put together the big picture. And so, it's, and I'll quote, and regardless of your political point of view, as a historical quote, right? Trust but verify. When President Reagan was talking about the Soviets, well, you're out there, you're looking at things, but you're constantly needing to verify, because if we're back to the issue of the truth of what happened and wanting to do that service for the public, well, that we constantly have to be in that research and analysis mode. And this is one of many episodes that we'll do on a range of things tied to research and analysis. We're already hinting at it, and I kind of planned, depending on how time went tonight, we might maybe consider a whole separate discussion on crowdsourcing. Some of you may have never heard that term. Some of you have. I'm sure Natasha has. And so there's a lot of discussion out there, right? Merriam-Webster online dictionary, crowdsourcing, the practice of obtaining needed services, ideas, or content by soliciting contributions from a large group of people, and especially from the online community, rather than from traditional employees or suppliers. Now, crowdsourcing is discussed in various contexts: marketing, business context, development, research contexts. There are people that certainly discuss it from a journalism standpoint, and so we don't necessarily have to get too in depth to that notion tonight. But when we're thinking about the idea of relying on the crowd or crowdsourcing, that involves human sources. It may involve some other things too tied to research in terms of the tasks or documents or mapping, other things that people do. But certainly the human element and the human involvement plays a role in that. And whether that's something that happens immediately, or that's bringing that crowd notion to something that's been on the table for a long time, and now we're trying to do a fresh take on it. But that crowdsourcing notion, and I've been thinking up through the weekend to today, maybe it would make sense to even have a whole separate episode on that notion of crowdsourcing. But when there's a case, and I mentioned this in the last episode, for more than one case, right? If you're out there trying to find information and or network with people to have ongoing discussion, we put out posts. I use Craigslist, social media is a possibility. There are times too that you're doing research on a case, and you're looking through older media reports. You're looking, you're listening, you're seeing what's discussed, you're thinking about people who might know people. You might do some genealogical research to try to discern who might have family connections. And you kind of come up with a list of names, right? Who might be directly or indirectly knowledgeable about this. Of course, you deal with common names or more unique names, people that are tied to an area, people that might have known the person or lived in the area. And of course, then finding those folks, right? That's a challenge. And then approaching them. And now this is not for everyone, right? I mean, the idea of calling someone up and very clearly identifying, why am I calling you? I'm not a salesperson. As I say right nowadays, rightly, so many people are on edge about that. Not that sales are bad. It's just that people get a lot of calls, a lot of emails, and some are scams, right? So you have to do that. Sometimes you have to determine, is it best to approach someone with an email or some other digital message? When you have the information, tell them why you're calling. Sort of reaching out to them to network, to find sources. I know there might be at least one of you, maybe not, who've had this experience of just establishing that initial contact with any sort of, whether it's journalism or otherwise, for dealing with a missing persons case. Has any, Natasha, and you don't have to necessarily get into everything proprietary for Unfound, but is there any experience you've had with establishing that connection and finding a human source?
No. However, I do reach out to prior guests on the show to see if they want to leave any testimonials.
Yeah.
And that is really the only outreach that I have with the actual client or the guest. And hopefully that's a good experience, which would leave the door open, just like on the digital side with the website, just leave the door open. However, now that I'm thinking about it, when I just do Google searches or the articles that are already listed on the episode itself, on Podomatic, on the description in YouTube. If there is a journalist tied to the case, then I have been able to find one that has worked for a major news television show, major network. So now we're friends on Facebook, and just basically to invite them to listen to our episode, and then
Yeah.
just let us know, just open communication if there are any updates, and then we'll share back and forth. So that was really exciting.
And what you're doing, Natasha, is from a journalistic standpoint and a PR standpoint, you're maintaining Ed's unfound relationship with those guests, many of whom he's, having varying degrees of ongoing communication with. And then in terms of the PR for the show, and the show is now, to think about the Unfound platform or framework, you're also continuing to push in a good way its visibility. So again, the whole question of human sources become important there. Would you agree?
Yeah, and it's really easy for me because it's passive. So I usually find the journalist on Facebook, send them a message, and whenever they want to respond, they respond. So I just feel like it's a superior form of communication. I think that we're all enjoying in the 21st century, versus just the phone ringing and
Yeah,
dropping everything to answer the phone.
sure, sure. Anyone else wanna? This one I'm not necessarily going to jump from person to person because this is one that is a more particular experience. Has anyone else, either on journalism or some other entry into all this, done any outreach to, whether it be to interview or to get the ball rolling or to find information or to get people involved? Anything with human sources you'd like to share in your experience along those lines? Okay. Any challenges, Natasha, or any recommendations if someone were doing any of this in their own context? Anything you'd recommend?
Yeah, definitely. It's easier than people think, unless you've already, obviously you have experience to just create a blog nowadays. And there are so many videos on YouTube of how to do it. Uh, so it's easy in a sense to become your own armchair journalist and then have your own blog dedicated to, for example, an episode or a case like Remer that speaks to you. And then, of course, that blog is a living thing. So when I reached out to the journalist, then I also obviously gave her a link to the blog, which has her article, and she thanked me. And it's just this ongoing dialogue. But it's important as the content producer, the person creating the blog, the mindset that it is a living, breathing organism, that it's alive. That's how I think about it, and I check every day to see what the traffic is like, and so on, and whether there are 3 entries in a week for a particular case, or it takes 3 weeks. And the important thing is that we're continuing to move the case forward from a digital perspective, from a content perspective.
Yeah, wow, that's insightful. Let me mention too, and again, as I said, after the session this week, I will send out any links that I mentioned or citing. Um, I mentioned this term citizen journalism, and again, that's another term. There's if you go to the Poynter, POYNTER.org, and the article, and it's from '05, the 11 layers of citizen journalism, and that provides a good overview, and people can, and certainly some things have shifted or changed, but there's some things on that are still very relevant, and one doesn't necessarily have to embrace everything there in their overview, but it's a good overview about the ways that we talk about citizen journalism, and folks, getting involved either as participants at that level or really in a more, way of creating their own content. And of course, that's continued to be more possible with some of the tech streamlining that's happened with whether it's audio or video or blogging. And I know that we see a number of those persons who blog about cases, missing persons cases, or cold cases, or a number of other things. Of course, we've stressed in the last episode, and we'll continue to stress it, that importance of accuracy. But yeah, that idea of getting involved, and if you're going to get involved, it's important to know, right? And so whether it's a professional journalist or someone doing freelance in a more professional way, or someone doing citizen journalism, it's kind of important to understand. Now, when we talk about dealing with sources, and there are sometimes some variance in how you'll hear these conversations or these terms used. I'm going to mirror the Associated Press's definition of ap.org and their discussion of particularly their page that talks about anonymous sources, although it gets into sourcing in general. And so when we talk about on the record, someone who wants to go on the record, and that's sort of, I guess, obvious or understood, right? If someone, whether it be in a written piece or in an audio piece or video piece, whether they go on the record themselves or they have no problem with being quoted or paraphrased by name. And obviously, Ed does a lot of great work with getting people on the record, and so we see that. Sometimes we hear the term off the record. And so, so from one view of the precise view of that term, that really means that information is not to be published. And so the value of off the record information is that it's providing guidance. It's providing context for the researcher. Obviously, that sort of communication requires a degree of rapport and trust, and obviously, again, the whole trust but verify mindset and method dynamic needs to continue on the part of the researcher. But that's providing information. Certainly, in the case of that information, the researcher might be able to find other ways of being able to expand their knowledge of that information, or even talk about that information with other types of attribution. But until that's the case, that can't be discussed, right? And so if they're going to maintain that relationship with that source, then they have to honor those terms. And that's an important thing. If you're trying to establish, and to use the Remer case, and if you've listened to the episode, Ed talks about it openly, where, one of the small parts I had in that case was helping Ed to approach, the professor that's named in that episode. And he did, he read there the key elements of the email that I had sent. And so, that's an approach that for me, whether I'm helping Ed with something or something for myself, is that's an important thing that you will see, right? Even on the AP site, ap.org, is clarity of terms, right? So that people have an understanding, two ways what they're getting into. And so that's off the record. So you also hear the term background. Now, this is where if you're watching a news report or listening to a podcast or reading a blog, and someone says, right, a source close to the situation, or a source who's a family member, or a source who's such and such. So their name is not necessarily being put to that information, but there's some agreement to what extent their proximity to the situation can be articulated, and so that's background. And then if something's on deep background, and this is where they don't want not only their name not mentioned, but their connection to the situation, right? And you can see how in some cases that would be, whether it's because of risk or some other credibility issue in their life or, whatever, if they're saying, okay, you can talk about this, but you can't attribute it to me or say anything about me, right? So that's deep background. So on the record, off the record, background, deep background. Now, again, you can see on the AP page, and I'm mentioning them because they give a good explanation of these terms. They also talk about their policies, and again, even today here, I'm not necessarily reflecting all of Ed's editorial policies. I'm giving more of a general explanation. But when folks do this at a professional level, whether they're dealing with employees or freelance people, right? There's an understanding between the editor and the journalists, and then of course an understanding, between the journalists and their sources. But it's important no matter what, even if you're doing citizen journalism and you want to do some of your own networking, um, you want to have a really clear understanding with the, persons whom you're talking to, um, and in what they're comfortable with you sharing, and do they want to go off the record or they want to go on background. And then because these terms are thrown around a lot, to have an understanding that they know what you mean and you know what they mean, and that's important. Now in some cases, let's just use Unfound, someone goes on the program, here I am, I'm talking, well obviously they're on the record, like vocally or visually. But if it's written journalism, or even if it's Unfound and something like Unfound, and someone is open with Ed, and they're not necessarily going to go on the program, but they're on the record. So understanding those boundaries and those latitudes, that's important material, especially when you think about it with missing persons cases, especially, right? We're dealing with things that could involve, very personal material, crime or alleged crime, things pertaining to the missing person themselves or their family or people they knew or law enforcement, legal political issues, etc. And again, I'm not a lawyer. Obviously, there's all sorts of legal political issues. One of the things that we think about, and again, in the American context, and again, regardless of one's political point of view, right, that a lot of the discussions when you get into citizen journalism and journalism in general, and what's those boundaries between professional journalism and citizen journalism, is of course that, people operate under the First Amendment, which, controversies or uncontroversial thing, it provides a space, at least from the American point of view, for folks to be involved in the issues and the events, locally, regionally, and nationally. So we don't need to get into all those controversies here, but obviously in the American context, there's latitude, and with the internet and social media and blogging, there's been a widening of ways in which people think about the ways in which they can get involved. And you'll see some of that in that 11 layers article that I mentioned. Let me take a moment here and ask if anyone had any comments or questions on anything that I've said here. Tanya, anything you'd like to add or ask? And
not at this point. I have some other notes that I've written down based on what we were going to be discussing, but I don't think now's the time probably to talk about those.
Yep, nope. And I'm going to be jumping to some of those other questions soon. Kathy, anything you'd like to add or ask?
No, but the only thing I would add is that I don't have a background in journalism. My degree is in psychology.
Yes.
And my career was with the IRS, so taxes. But I certainly have had experience myself calling up people with kind of bad news, you're being audited.
Yeah.
You have to be really careful. And I think it applies as well with these, journalism type issues. You've got to really watch what you say and how you say it, and just be really sensitive to the whole situation. I think that's what I would say.
Kathy, again, this is great because in these discussions, it's keeping me moving forward and reminding me of things. I had safety and security written, and of course, you're also hinting at or pointing to just the important human rapport building. So the caution and pace, okay, at the human level, because, like in the case certainly of an audit or even talking about difficult things like missing persons, okay, it's that human element. We care about people while we're trying to get to the truth. We have to respect people and communicate at a pace. But then also, too, and whether you're doing journalism or citizen journalism or activism or awareness raising or any of the things we're talking about in these forums, you also have to think about safety of yourself and others and the risks that people engage in safety security issues and not knowing how people are going to react. And so there's a whole spectrum of considerations here that are very important. So that's helpful for sure. Concha, anything you'd like to add? And again, it's okay if no, I just want to check. Okay, Natasha, anything you'd like to add or ask?
Hi, Eric. Just one question. How do you source a deep background?
Okay, so you could, and again, you're going to see various examples or discussions of this. You could simply say, and as I put this here on recording, I want to say that there are many people out there in the world who are, although my background and training is in communication, there are people who are much more expert in media studies and technical journalism than I, but you could simply say, right, on deep background, I've learned such and such, right? And I'm sure, Natasha, have you ever heard that in a media outlet?
No, I've never heard of it.
Yeah, or a background source, but then you don't give anything, right? They may not use the word deep background. There may be the case that some journalists too just simply, run with the information and then try to corroborate it through things that they can speak to. And again, if you look at news outlets like the AP, they have specific policies, editorial policies that govern sort of the scope and timing of what their journalists should do. If a journalist is able to get something, let's say it is on background or deep background, and then but they can figure out some other ways to corroborate it and get some other sourcing, okay. But it might be too that if they're able to get more than one, uh, you know, background and or deep background source, then that gives the information more credibility. And then they have to sort out how they frame that. Is that, am I answering your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. And so yeah, that's a short answer there. And if I in future episodes can find some concrete examples for that, because I'm sure we'll return to some of these things in the future. I will, for sure. Okay. Okay. Well, this is very good. I do the safety security consideration is a good one. So thank you for that. Thinking about the issue of, and I'm going to mention here again, just some walking through, and granted, you could say, well, and I've used the term citizen journalism. Sometimes I talk about freelance, and you can say, well, someone like myself who's, you have these communication degrees, and although you're not necessarily a journalism or media studies professor, you have knowledge. So, but there are people who have other expertise or experience bases who do this, and maybe they fall more squarely in citizen journalism. But regardless of that, whether it be the professional all the way down to the everyday person who's doing citizen journalism, it's important to think through these principles and practices. Be clear with people, and I've been open. I can't get into all the details here, but and I've mentioned publicly elsewhere, that one case that I've gotten interested under my own sort of uh, cases, of course, and again, it's always good to cite your own media sources, right? I heard it on Unfound, the Nicholas Masucci case. So tremendous interview. Listen to it if you haven't. So I said, okay, I'm going to run with that. This is tremendous material. It's an older case. Nicholas disappeared 1974, and New Jersey. And so obviously, when you're dealing with a case like that, it's 1974. It's an older case, and I've developed some sources there who are some level of background and or some level of, even at this point, off the record, more probably on the background side. But point is even for those parts, even to get to that, and I'm still working through that. This is an older case, right? Just touching base with people, it's a challenge. So thinking about what are some of the audiences, well, obviously law enforcement people, whether it be local, state, even federal, from that time, that's a challenge because folks who were in law enforcement at that time are either retired or deceased. Obviously, too, and it's according to public records now, and so this is not getting to anything that's allegedly Mr. Masucci had some connection to organized crime, allegedly. So obviously I've been trying to network and find my way into some folks who even might be in that world, who might have some knowledge or heard anything about that case. And again, quote unquote, heard anything. That doesn't mean I'm automatically trusting them. But again, it's an avenue. Trust but verify. So, where do I get these names? Well, obviously, looking at media reports, and not necessarily about Nicholas, because there aren't a lot, not many at all, none really. But other cases from around that time, other relevant discussions about the area, that part of New Jersey, people that might have been in organized crime, task force, whatever. New Jersey in the 1970s, from the 60s, there was a lot of competition in organized crime in terms of gambling, etc. Trying to identify people that if they're still alive. And again, there's a whole nother discussion on finding these people, but identifying those folks that really might have some either direct or indirect knowledge. And again, they might not know anything, right? And you do talk to people, even in law enforcement, that they never heard of the case, they don't have any suggestions, or they might have some idea of, well, have you thought of this, but nothing concrete. Part of it is that passion. You got to keep going, right? You're looking at these things, you're taking notes. You go back and re-listen to an episode or you read other reports, and you're thinking, what have I missed? Whom should I talk to, and to whom? And so that's part of the adventure of it. And so that's a case where, and again, safety, security play a role in that. And I'm certainly by no way as involved in these sorts of things as someone like Ed, but you just never know, right? Because you're out there, especially nowadays when information, remember the information that we obtain about people can also do the same for us. So when you're doing these sorts of things, be conscientious, understand, whom you're talking to and why, are the risks, not just for them, but for you. And so that's important to consider. Thinking through those, who should I talk to? Who's going to have knowledge of that case? Who might have known Nicholas or known someone who knew him, who heard about it? Why weren't there more reports? Now, granted, I've not looked at every media report from New Jersey in the 70s, but I've looked at the lot, and there haven't been a lot of discussion. So you have to rely on human sources, and so that's a challenge. So when we're talking about communication skills, and we're getting at this, and I'm just talking through some examples some of you mentioned, what sort of communication skills or research skills, analysis skills, and some of you have hinted at this, you know, what skills are important to do this sort of human source networking and outreach? And then what role can technology play? And I know that Natasha has hinted at this. Tanya, were any of your comments tied to this issue?
They a little, but no, not I don't think real specifically.
Okay, well, we're going to keep moving through. Concha, how about you? Is there anything you want to say to in terms of communication or human skills, research skills in general, or anything about technology? Okay, that's okay too. Kathy, how about you?
Well, I think just the obvious ones that you or that I do as a layperson, looking at what's available online, what kind of research you can find, maybe even public ways to find people. And I've used from some of the podcasts, some of the people involved, maybe to find out how old this person maybe is, different
Yeah.
sources that I have used. Obviously, I don't have access to the types of records we used when I was working, but I know how to do a lot of that kind of research, just my own. And it's just so important because in these missing person cases, you can kind of get an idea of what is probably true and what probably isn't,
Yeah.
and what kind of directions to go. Like when you really, really research a case, yeah, all these people say this, but no, I think we can probably rule that out. So it's just really important, whatever time you've got to allot to doing, I think research is just tremendously important in something like missing person cases, at least from my own experience, just as a lay person.
It's an incredibly important component. And I know, again, to use Unfound as an example, you know the time and the effort that Ed and some folks from the team could put in and going into one episode, and then the ongoing work, and then, you know, from other experiences that I or you all might be familiar with, to really get deep research. And whether it's documentary evidence, media reports, government records, human contacts, and making those linkages, you know, and trying to find names. And I mentioned genealogical research. Here's an example. And again, someone might say, well, why, you know, it's, if done properly and for a good reason, it can be ethical. You know, you're looking at genealogy research, and obviously one of the unfortunate elements of human life is that people die. And so you're trying to figure out who knew whom, and, you know, obituaries, right? And trying to figure out, you know, whose family and friends, where they're at in someone's life, and where people live. Sometimes locations are disclosed, and of course that might be a 20-year-old obituary, but it certainly can give you a snapshot. You know, and so, yeah, thinking about the different types or artifacts of research, various records play a role in identifying key people. When you think about people and the sort of networks they have or had, there's family, there's, you know, friends, family, there are business relationships, community relationships, political relationships, and certainly nowadays, especially with digital technology, you can find those and trace those relationships, um, you know, to figure out who might be around that one might still be able to talk to. Natasha, how about you? Anything about communication skills and research skills, and then anything further, because you've mentioned technology in different ways, that you want to mention about what role technology can play in all this?
Well, I'll surprise everyone with my answer, which is not going to dwell on technology for once. I have a background in cultural anthropology, so I would
Wow.
definitely, the first thing that I would do would be to try to obtain as much information as possible on the cultural relevance And that could be anything from geography to socioeconomic level, obviously language, and generational influences as well.
Yeah, that's a helpful consideration. Um, and whether that is, genealogical um, insight, or I guess in terms of culture, that especially from an anthropological point of view, that encompasses a variety of cultural practices and influences that could be ethnic, geopolitical, religious, etc. So understanding the context of the time in which someone lived and breathed, and how that may influence the persons at that time and then us now, right? In terms of how we're understanding and interpreting that, correct?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, that's a really good insight. And so, yes. Okay, so this is helpful, and okay, and I'm just looking at yep. Okay. Now, I wanted to mention next, and as we were thinking through the and I mentioned some examples here, and moving the if you're out there and you see this, and whether it's the media or the family, or obviously journalists, media, and then law enforcement does this, you put a sort of wide net out for tips, and sometimes people are submitting information, and sometimes people might want to step forward and say, I want to talk. There's a process that goes forward, obviously, where you have to sort of screen them out, but there is an initial, and this could be a case where something just happened, someone just goes missing, or if someone's been missing for some time and folks are trying to fish for leads or for tips, there is a space or a sphere there where, okay, this person is starting to identify themselves some. You have to proceed cautiously. You have to try to build a trust, do what you can to research to make sure that they have credibility. But sometimes you just have to have the conversation. This is something important to consider with technology, and whether this is communication skills, research skills, whether it's academia, journalism, business, everyday life. The old fashioned research skills are always going to be important, right? Putting the time in, looking at the documents, talking to people, being able to talk to people, understanding sort of the terms of the arrangement, um, having having a sense of direction, staying organized. The technology, which can be incredibly helpful. Again, the pros and cons. The technology, which can be incredibly helpful. There are so many sources out there, digital documents, government documents, genealogical material, ways of finding people, right? All that can be important, but we can never forget about those old-fashioned ways of doing research, which necessarily involves talking to people. Now, of course, in an academic setting, depending on the type of research, right, there are different protocols to be followed. Obviously, journalists are under a different framework, but they still have to follow and think through certain protocols. And even if you're going to do this just as a citizen journalist, if you're going to be out there talking to people, have a basic understanding of these concepts, and putting in the time, and being thorough, which is what some of you are hinting at. You can't get away from the importance of those old-fashioned research and communication skills, and even practicing, right? And who knows, maybe some of us can practice at some time, and say, okay, what if I'm calling someone up, and I do this, right? I let them know why I'm calling, and right, again, I might, I'm not a salesperson, I'm not a scammer. I'm doing research on this particular case, whatever, Masucci case or some other case, and I'd like to talk about such and such. Um, depending on what their connection is to that area or that person, or if they have no real direct connection, but they might be someone who lived in the area, and I wanted to just talk to them about some other event. Being clear diplomatic. That's important. Ed has a tremendous, obviously Ed has a tremendous, he's done so many interviews, and getting people to an interview in an audio or video journalism, you know, that is an art and a practice that Ed does so well. And so that's something to think about. I'm going to go back to you, Tanya, because we have about a half hour. You had some thoughts, and instead of just jumping around on the questions here, let me know which question you had some thoughts on, and please share.
Okay, it might have been the crowdsourcing
Yes.
question, maybe. But anyway, my mind went to, and maybe these already, exist, but small, and maybe not small, but in every community, in every local community, have people who are trained, and they either volunteer or they're paid somehow. But in every community, who has a specific role that involves very specific tasks, so that when a case comes up, it's kind of like if a house catches fire, then somebody knows, okay, contact the fire department. They all come out. Everybody knows exactly what they have to do. One's driving the vehicle, some have the hose, some are going in the house, so everybody has a specific task to do. And I was just thinking, so when a missing persons case comes up, that group can activate right away, very quickly. And they already know, one person might interview a family, but you have to be very careful of, like you were saying, the sensitive information, and that person would need to be trained, I'm sure, how to say things and what to ask, what not to ask, and that kind of thing. And then another person, would be looking at all their social media contacts from work, contacts from any extracurricular activities they're in, contacts, church contacts, whatever. Though it would help them do two things: maybe just know who they've been in contact with, and then, who they know. And also it would let people know, hey, this person has gone, missing. And then someone's there to analyze that information, see if there's any patterns that come up. There's other people searching in vehicles. I know you can't really probably search grounds because you don't know if you're going to tamper with any evidence, step on something you shouldn't be stepping on. But like I said, these people would have to go through some type of training, but they wouldn't necessarily need to have a 4-year degree or something to do this.
Yeah.
And then somebody else would be searching with drones. Someone else would be creating posts, social media posts, and hanging flyers and putting them out there, and putting out, posts on every social media account. So basically, I have a ton of notes on that, but basically, just everybody would have their task to do. And so it could happen very, very quickly and happen all at once. So the information can get out as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Wow. You've covered a lot of interesting thoughts there. That's very helpful. Anyone else have anything to add to that? Kathy, you'd like to add to that?
I probably need to learn a little more about some of these, how different people get involved. But she's brought up a lot of really good things that need to happen. Training people. Oh, one thing I can say is interviewing people. That is something I do have experience with. I had to interview my taxpayers on every case. And so I've done hundreds and hundreds of interviews.
Yeah.
And you just learn from experience, how to be careful with people, how to be friendly, how to develop a rapport. And so this is really important, talking about the human sources here, that you don't step on their toes or you don't offend them, and then you're accepting of how involved they want to be, and you don't accuse them of things. You just build a really nice rapport is what I'd say. But I think interviewing people, it's a skill that you learn, but it's not super difficult in my opinion. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. Natasha, anything you'd like to add to that?
I'm good, thanks.
Yep. Okay. Concha, just to check. Okay. No, that's helpful. training and development, and this is something to think about. Obviously, when we talk about getting people involved either on the journalism side or awareness side, whatever, PR, marketing, you're going to have to deal with people. You're going to have to deal with human sources. We're going to want to be thinking about what to do and what not to do, right? And and we've talked about rapport building and having respect for people, but of course you also need to stay on task and deal with issues of time. That's important, for sure. And thinking through what resources are available. But yeah, it's not everyone needs to have a 4-year college degree to do this, for sure. But it is helpful to think about some ways in which we can continue to prompt more interest and encourage more training along these lines. And that might be something to think through. And again, maybe some practice sessions, not necessarily during a Unfound on the ground, but giving people an opportunity to maybe do some mock outreach and then maybe some mock interviews. Interviewing such an important skill. We do that anyway, right? In terms of our, many of our jobs, whether it's academic research, journalism, auditing, job interviews, feedback that we're either giving or gathering from peers or peer feedback or managers, employment, right? There's a skill set there that's involved with interviewing. And this is kind of this leads to another question I had from an audience perspective, which it was kind of implied, but it wasn't completely on my list, and I'm going to use again Ed as an example, obviously Unfound. When we listen to those and when we think through those interviews and it gets us it gives us a lot of food for thought. When we hear a good interview like that, Tanya, what on an Unfound, for instance, and how does that help us? What does that give us as a sort of takeaway with these cases?
Well, when you listen to a lot of them, you see different patterns developing, which Ed's mentioned many times. There's certain things that seem to come up in many of the cases.
Yeah.
That are, similar. And I had another thought on that, but I don't remember what that was.
That's okay.
Well, just getting the information out there right away is very important. I would think, like, as quickly as possible. And any photos. If you think about it, this is just something that just popped into my head, but if a pet goes missing,
yeah,
you pretty much know where you can go to find, like, locally, to find that information on that pet. Oh my gosh, what's that dog look like? Where was he at? I was just in that area. What kind of dog was it? Whose dog was it? And so people look and have all the information right there very quickly. So that came up. I don't know where that fits into all of this. And then I have another thought, but it's not related to this, I don't think.
That's okay. Yeah, no, that's helpful. I have my notes here. I want to make a connection. How about Kathy? How about you? When we hear these extensive interviews on a program like Unfound, with whether it be family members or someone else involved, what's our takeaway from that? How does that enhance our experience as a listener?
Oh, I think you can gain a lot of knowledge by listening to a podcast. Some of them I've listened to repeatedly. Of course, I have the time since I'm retired, no longer working. Makes a big difference. But one thing that I catch myself doing a lot now is I'm following what he's asking, what Ed is asking, and I can pretty much usually figure out why he's asking it. So the more we get more familiar with the investigative side of this, of analyzing these cases and what we need to extract from the guest and what will help us further this investigation and try to find this missing person, if you really follow it like that, you can really learn a lot. That has been my experience so far.
Yeah. Natasha, how about you? What takeaways in your perspective as a team member, as someone who's listened to many programs, right? How does that enhance our experience as listeners to hear these interviews?
Well, there's definitely a teaching component. One of the things that has been interesting, relevant to this discourse that I had learned, so it's top of mind, is the timing of approaching a witness or a source. And so it has been mentioned recently in several of the episodes. So it would be, try to reach out to any ex-girlfriends. If the if someone has passed away, then at that point, maybe somebody would be able to talk. So I found that the timing to be a very interesting topic in and of itself.
Yeah, no, that is, yeah. And there's a lot of nuance that goes with thinking through um, the reaching out, the willingness component, the way in which we as people might approach people, and of course the value of listening to a program like Unfound, and of course Ed gets into a lot of really deep discussions with some of these folks. It's a good learning experience, if you ever want to do any of this in any sort of output form. Obviously it'd be good to get some examples and to track and listen and re-listen to some of these episodes. Again, I highly recommend the Cameron Remer episode, in really seeing how sort of the big picture of human sources and other sorts of evidence sort of come together. And as you know, right, there's things that are definitively unresolved along those lines for sure. Anyone else have anything to add at this point? Because I want to move on. We have about 15 to 20 minutes left. And I want to, anything else we want to add? I got Tanya and Kathy, Natasha. And Concha, anything you like to add? Again, it's okay if you say no or don't say anything. I just want to make sure you have a chance. Our takeaways from listening to these sorts of human interviews.
This is Tanya. I mean, I have an idea on something, but I don't know if this already exists, and I can mention it at the end of the program if you'd like, because I don't think it relates to what you're talking about right now.
Nope, go ahead and mention it now.
Okay, and maybe you've mentioned this. I'm sorry if you have, and I didn't hear that, or if it does exist. But I was just thinking, there's a lot of different resources out there, a lot of different websites. If there could be maybe one particular site that someone can go to when something like this happens, and then all of their resources are on one site, like Charlie's Project, NAMUS, like everything on one site that can easily be, found and sifted through.
And so you would say, are you saying that we should have one site where all the best of the best missing persons resources are available?
Yes, like everything that you'd need for missing persons cases. So if something came up, or if somebody went missing, say, a family member or something, there's one specific place that you can go and you can find those resources to everything, whether you're a member of a missing person's family, and something's happening right now and you need to find a resource, or if you're somebody that wants to just help and they want to go through and they want to research different cold cases and things, just anything you want to do basically around a missing person's case, as somebody like just me, or like I said, if God forbid somebody ever came up missing that I knew, I could go to just that type of a resource where there wasn't so much, because you've mentioned a lot of different resources and a lot of different places to go, a lot of different websites. Maybe if there was one particular one you go to and you find all of those resources, that could be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I know some sites out there, and of course with the Unfound platform, that one can piece together different sites that Ed and the team have highlighted, and there are other places out there that might have certain lists of things, but you're looking for one big crossroads. I don't know, Natasha, you're more of a digital expert than I. How could something like this work, or is there anything like that out there?
Well, thank you for the suggestion. We can certainly do that on the Unfound website. We can add a reference tab and have the names and the descriptions of the major players. So the Charlie Project, NamUs, and so on, even AP. Actually, we should have a reference for the Unfound on the ground. We already have, obviously, a page for that, but Eric deserves a reference clearly as we're talking about this. So thank you very much for the suggestion.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and in terms of obviously research and analysis in general, that would be very helpful at any level that someone would want to get into mix. And then also on the human sources side, that sort of research thoroughness and mindset in terms of the nuance of who one should speak to and what's the sort of knowledge, because also too, when you're getting ready to talk to people, you have to demonstrate a degree of credibility. So whether it's the Masucci case or any case, right? If I'm calling someone and say, I'd like to talk about this, here's what I'm doing, people are going to rightly want to have a sense of, well, why is this person calling me? Are they presenting themselves honestly? And whether it's email or phone, I have to demonstrate a certain knowledge. And and in those cases too, this is where these terms come to play. If there's things I know about a case that's in the public record, or someone has, given me on background, or again, not necessarily talking about something that's off the record at that point, but I might have it from somewhere else that I've already have another source that I can talk about. I have to be able to present what I know, follow those terms, even in the ongoing research. And so that sort of research, this resource base that Tanya and Natasha are talking about here, could be helpful even with discovering direction for human sources, building knowledge to be able to ask the right questions, because now we're getting into the interview side of it. So, and again, certainly Ed's an expert of doing, on program interviews, but just the general idea of talking to people and asking them, respecting their time and asking them good questions requires the sort of thoroughness of research that Kathy referred to. Okay, so that's definitely an important consideration for sure. And yeah, that's why I wanted to mention, Natasha here, because she's sort of on the front line of, in general, and particularly for Unfound, kind of thinking about ways that we can link things together. I want to just go back and to answer that question, and I'll provide some follow-up in the future on the question of properly attributing on deep background. One thing we have to keep in mind is because it's the issue of the person doesn't even want to be mentioned as someone close to it, right? So even the idea of not even indicating their anonymity is important. So I misspoke there in saying, well, you'd say, well, on deep background. Well, the problem with that is people don't even want to be perceived as close to the thing. So sometimes, and again, I just adding one more source here, and again, this will be on my link list, Writing and Reporting for the Media, 11th edition, Oxford University Press, is that sometimes people will say, it has been learned that, or they just really, really avoid the idea of saying, right, because you don't want to say, well, someone anonymous it's staying away from any of that. And and you'll see this with whether it's the AP discussion or this discussion or others, editors and journalists really grapple with the question of how to use, so deep background stuff, right? Even discussions about grappling with off the record and on background, when you get into that deep background, that stuff becomes more. So to answer that question tentatively, it's stating it sometimes folks are using, right, it's been learned that, or something along those lines, Natasha. And I sort of misspoke on the issue of saying, well, yeah, on deep background, because there the problem is that those folks don't even want to be perceived or hinted at as that someone anywhere close to that situation is talking, because it could be something that could put their careers, lives, something else at risk. Maybe, I don't want to overly dramatize it, but in some cases it could be that. So does that clarification help, Natasha?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yep. And there'll be more on that in the future. We have about 10 minutes, and just so that we make sure that everyone is contributing before we summarize, Tanya, you've brought a lot of good thoughts tonight, and we've jumped around a bit on the questions. So in terms of either interest or experience, or as a listener, or as a researcher, or as an advocate, is there anything else you'd like to add or ask tonight, Tanya?
No, I don't think tonight. But I love everything that you guys are doing. I love what Ed does. I love what you're doing. I just really, yeah. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that appreciate this. So thank you for all your work.
Yeah, and you're welcome. And again, thanks to you and all the think tank members and who are involved with this. And please, folks, continue to provide feedback. There's improvements I know I need to make, and we collectively want to continue to make. And they'll, again, keep your ears open for the next announcement of the episode toward the end of the June. And Natasha's continuing to rightly push me to continue to catch up on some things to sort of complete the picture of how we're presenting this. And there's going to be other folks besides me leading and facilitating these discussions, especially as we get into some of the other areas. So for sure. Kathy, anything else tonight? I want to make sure you've had a chance to articulate anything that you wanted to ask or mention.
Just that I've really appreciated your time and efforts in doing all this. I have learned quite a bit tonight in different approaches you can take or involvements each of us can have. But I love Unfound. I've only been in it since January of 2019, but I am fully supporting of everything that Ed does and that the group does. And I love being in the think tank and being able to discuss the individual cases. It really keeps your mind active, and you need to think about all these things, and you might make a mistake assuming this or this or this. And it's a tremendous learning experience, especially for someone like me, because as you get older, I am 66, you must keep your mind active. When you're not going to work every day, I think it's really important, and I really appreciate all of your efforts in doing this. I thank you very much.
Yeah, and you're welcome, but also thanks to you and all the think tank folks. You know, this is, and you made the point earlier about just the passion and precision, both that need to go into research. And so certainly at the level of the work that Ed's doing, and then the team, and then things that we're doing, you know, collectively or individually, just being really thorough and really pushing ourselves to be thorough. And again, this is one of the things, and we all know this is part of the culture of Unfound, is just the idea that, you know, again, this grounded concept, there's right a couple different ways, Unfound on the ground, but really to have, you know, solid to the best possible. What are the facts, right? Because when we're doing analysis, we want it to be based on the facts. So even when we're making, you know, inferences, those have to be based on the facts to the best that we can know them. And yes, over time, things get revised and we learn new information, and that's where the human sources come into play. And, you know, you want to get what you can. You need to have your good documentary evidence in terms of, you know, government documents and other documents and media reports and old media reports, but you have to sift through that and find the accuracies and the inaccuracies and make the connections. And even with the human sources, you have to continue to trust but verify and make your corroborations, and it's a ongoing process. And sometimes you're going to find inconsistencies, and that doesn't mean that people are necessarily being dishonest, right? There's just the human reality of of sometimes memories change, or someone heard something inaccurate. It's just like with genealogy, and I'm an amateur genealogist. It's been a hobby of mine for a while. And we all have this experience, right? We hear stories that are passed on in the family, and they're all important, right? It's like, okay, these narratives. And you sometimes might hear a little different version here, a little different version there. And that doesn't mean anyone's necessarily being intentionally dishonest. They just have heard it and it was passed on a different way. And you, as someone who does the amateur genealogy, you want to hear everyone's telling of it. Now, that doesn't mean they're all equally accurate. Your job as the genealogist is to look at the documents and hear the stories and figure out of what's true and maybe it was misconstrued and whatever, and it takes time, right? So same with something like this, right? For any sort of research is to be sifting consistently through the different types of evidence and ways in which we hear the narratives and testimonies and whatnot, and continue to hang in there for passionate research. Concha, anything you'd like to ask or add? Okay, Natasha, anything you'd like to say before we conclude?
No, just thank you very much. I have a recommendation for a podcast with excellent journalism for a missing person. It's called In the Dark, and the first season is focused on the Jacob Wetterling case. And the journalist does a very good job of going through several episodes and mostly interviewing the person of interest and how just being designated as a person of interest changed his life.
Wow, thank you for that. And I get inspired. You know, we all have our own, you know, things that we're working on and collaborating on, and you know what's going on here with this discussion for me too, and for the teamwork, you know, that Ed's team. I'm excited to be a part of that. And like I said in the last episode, I do a lot. The other team members do a lot more than I for the program, but it's exciting to be a part of that. I have some of my own material, maybe, you know, approximately 5 or 6 cases at any given time, approximately. And I just getting excited to get more involved with that, especially now that summer's here, and thinking about ways that we can collaborate. Because again, just to start summarizing here, right? We know that with just sort of being involved here, we care about the people, we care about actually solving these cases. You know, it's not just about the sensationalism, it's really about the getting to the truth and caring about the people, and the truth's not always easy, right? It's something that's a challenge. These are very difficult situations. Obviously, my interest is cold cases in general, unfound. It's about missing persons. That's what we're talking about. And these are very difficult situations. So it's keeping that focus and that precision. And tonight, you know, we've with your contribution, we've looked at, and again, I'll email the links, and we will, and I'll make sure to put together and continue to work with Natasha on continuing to get these things out there and documented. We've talked through, again, I said, listen through that Cameron Remer episode. Just a really good, and I think that was what, Natasha, 3 hours episode, something like that. It's a long one, right? Just to see the big picture of research. And we've just talked about some ways of, again, being clear with sources, and thinking through, you know, understanding, you know, the terms of communication. It's not something everyone's going to do, citizen journalism, but even if you're doing advocacy or awareness raising or help, or like some of us were saying, trying to build our networks of people who can get involved, you know, trust and credibility are important, safety and security are important. All these things certainly tie to our interest in collaboration and communication. I added tonight the idea of corroboration. That's important. We will have further conversation in the future on crowdsourcing. That's important. We'll continue for future episodes to send out questions ahead of time for thinking. And again, I want to just mention again what I always say when we're thinking about why it's important to talk to people. Someone out there knows something, or knows someone who knows something. Thank you again, folks, for your participation. This concludes Unfound on the Ground number 2. Thank you.